The tension inside the executive office at Forrester Creations had been building long before voices were raised, long before words sharpened into accusations, long before the future of the company, once considered unshakable, became something fragile enough to fracture under the weight of disagreement. Ridge stood near the window, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed outward as though the skyline itself might offer clarity, while Steffi remained across from him, her presence electric with urgency, her voice carrying the force of someone who refused to let silence bury what she believed was at stake. Their argument was not simply about direction, not merely about creative control or leadership decisions, but about identity, about legacy, about what Forrester Creations was meant to be in a world that no longer resembled the one in which it had been built. Ridge spoke from a place of preservation, of continuity, his instincts rooted in the belief that stability was the only way to protect what Eric had created, what generations of Forresters had sacrificed to sustain. To him, the company was not just a business. It was a living extension of their family, a structure that demanded respect for its foundation, even as it evolved. Steffi, however, saw that same foundation as something at risk of stagnation, something that could become irrelevant if it failed to adapt with enough speed and conviction. Her frustration was not born from rebellion, but from fear, the fear that holding on to tradition too tightly might become the very thing that destroyed them. Their voices overlapped, clashed, retreated, and surged again, each trying to assert a vision that neither was willing to compromise. What neither of them realized, what neither of them could yet see, was that their conflict was not occurring in isolation. While they debated direction and authority within the safety of familiar walls, something far more calculated was unfolding beyond their awareness, something that did not rely on emotion or legacy, but on timing, strategy, and a willingness to exploit every fracture they were exposing in real time. Ivy had been watching, not from the shadows in the literal sense, but from a distance defined by patience rather than absence, by observation rather than detachment. Where Ridge and Steffi argued openly, Ivy moved quietly, her intentions shielded behind a composure that had long allowed her to exist within the family without ever being fully understood. She had listened, learned, and waited, not because she lacked ambition, but because she understood that ambition, when revealed too early, became a target rather than a weapon. Her first move did not take place in the boardroom, nor in any official setting where power could be measured directly. It happened in private, in conversations that appeared incidental but were anything but. When she approached Electra and Will, she did so with precision, choosing a moment when both of them were emotionally unsettled, when recent events had already shaken their sense of stability. She did not confront them with grand declarations or obvious manipulation. Instead, she spoke in fragments, in suggestions, in carefully placed observations that felt more like concern than strategy. She spoke of uncertainty within the company, of leadership that seemed divided, of decisions being made without cohesion or foresight. She positioned herself not as a challenger, but as someone who understood the instability, who shared their concerns, who wanted to see something stronger emerge from the chaos. And then, slowly, she introduced possibility, not as a demand but as an invitation. A new structure, a new vision, a future in which they would not be sidelined or controlled by the legacy of others, but empowered to shape something of their own. The promise of influence was not stated outright, but it was there, embedded in her words, in the way she described what could be achieved if the right people aligned at the right moment. Electra, perceptive yet unsettled, felt the pull of that possibility even as she questioned its origin, while Will, still reeling from personal upheaval, found himself more susceptible to the idea that change, any change, might offer stability where none currently existed. Ivy did not ask for allegiance. She allowed it to form naturally, or at least to feel that way, planting seeds that would take root long before anyone realized what had been set in motion. By the time the emergency board meeting was called, the stage had already been prepared. The announcement itself had come with urgency, framed as a necessary response to growing instability, a chance to address concerns before they escalated further. Ridge arrived with controlled determination, Steffi with sharpened focus, both expecting confrontation, but within parameters they believed they understood. The boardroom filled quickly, familiar faces taking their places, each carrying their own expectations, their own assumptions about what the meeting would entail. Ivy entered last. There was nothing overtly dramatic about her arrival, nothing that signaled the magnitude of what was about to unfold, and yet there was something in her composure, something in the way she carried herself, that subtly shifted the atmosphere of the room. Confidence, not the kind that seeks validation, but the kind that comes from certainty, from knowing something no one else yet knows. When she began to speak, the room quieted not out of respect, but out of curiosity. Ivy had rarely positioned herself at the center of authority in such a direct way, and that alone was enough to command attention. Her voice was steady, her words measured, her tone carefully balanced between professionalism and assertion. She spoke first of the company's current state, acknowledging the tensions that had brought them there, the divisions that threatened to weaken their foundation. She did not accuse. She did not blame. She simply outlined a reality that no one in the room could fully deny. And then she shifted. The transition was subtle, but decisive, moving from observation to revelation with a precision that left no room for interruption. She began to speak of ownership, of shares, of the structural framework that determined who truly held power within Forrester Creations. At first, it seemed procedural, a necessary review of information they all understood. But as she continued, as the details became more specific, more pointed, a realization began to take shape, slow at first, then with increasing clarity. She had acquired something, not recently, not impulsively, but deliberately over time, in a manner so calculated that it had gone entirely unnoticed until this moment. She revealed that a significant portion of shares had been transferred through a series of transactions linked to an anonymous stakeholder, a figure who had remained invisible by design, operating through intermediaries, ensuring that no single movement would draw attention. And now, that anonymity was gone, because that stakeholder was Ivy. The words did not explode. They settled, heavy and undeniable, sinking into the room with a weight that silenced even the most immediate reactions. Ridge's expression shifted first, not into anger, but into disbelief, the kind that resists acceptance even as the evidence presents itself with undeniable clarity. Steffi followed, her reaction sharper, more immediate, her shock quickly transforming into something more volatile, something that refused to remain contained. Ivy did not rush the moment. She allowed it to unfold, to settle, to take hold of everyone present before continuing. She explained the structure, the percentages, the implications, not as justification but as fact. With the shares she had acquired, she now held controlling interest in the company. Not partial influence. Not a seat at the table. Control. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, filled with the collective realization that everything they had assumed about the balance of power within the company had been fundamentally altered without their knowledge. Ridge felt it as a collapse, not just of authority, but of trust, the understanding that something this significant had been orchestrated within his own environment without a single indication of its existence. Steffi felt it as a violation, a calculated intrusion into something she had fought to protect, her anger immediate and unrestrained. Ivy's smile, when it appeared, was not exaggerated, not theatrical, but unmistakably victorious. She did not apologize. She did not soften the impact. Instead, she leaned into it, her voice gaining strength as she declared what this shift meant, not just in terms of ownership, but in terms of direction. A new era, a new structure. A leadership that would no longer be bound by the limitations of tradition or internal conflict. And then, as if the room had not yet been pushed far enough, she introduced another element. Elliot. The name landed with a different kind of force, one that struck not just at authority, but at family itself. She announced, with the same calm certainty, that RJ would serve as her closest ally within the company, her right hand in executing the changes she intended to implement. The decision was not framed as a suggestion. It was presented as a reality already in motion. Ridge's reaction was immediate and devastating. If Ivy's acquisition of power had shaken him, this shattered something deeper, something more personal. RJ was not just an employee, not just a member of the company. He was his son. And the idea that RJ had aligned himself, willingly or otherwise, with something that had been orchestrated in secrecy, without his knowledge, without his trust, cut deeper than any corporate maneuver ever could. Steffi did not hold back. Her anger erupted, raw and unfiltered, her voice cutting through the room with a force that demanded acknowledgement. She accused Ivy not just of betrayal, but of manipulation, of deception so calculated that it bordered on something far more dangerous than ambition alone. She called her out for what she saw as a deliberate attempt to dismantle the family from within, to exploit every vulnerability, every fracture, every moment of distraction for personal gain. Ivy listened. She did not interrupt. She did not react with equal intensity. When Steffi finished, Ivy simply shrugged, a gesture so understated that it carried more provocation than any direct response could have. To her, the accusations were irrelevant, emotional reactions to a reality that had already been secured. She had not broken rules. She had used them. She had not seized power unlawfully. She had taken it where it was available. Ridge's strength faltered. Not physically at first, but internally, the realization settling in with a weight that made it difficult to remain upright in the way he had always been. He understood, in that moment, not just what had happened, but how completely they had been outmaneuvered. This was not a sudden attack. It was a long game, played with patience, executed with precision, and revealed only when it could no longer be undone. When he finally sank into the chair behind him, it was not an act of surrender, but the physical manifestation of a truth he could no longer resist. They had been deceived. Not by force, not by confrontation, but by something far more insidious. By someone who had been standing among them the entire time, watching, waiting, and preparing for the moment when everything they believed they controlled would slip out of their hands. And as the room remained suspended in that realization, the future of Forrester Creations no longer felt like something they could shape. It felt like something they had already lost. The silence that followed Ivy's declaration did not dissipate quickly, nor did it fracture into immediate chaos, as one might expect. Instead, it lingered, dense and suffocating, settling over the boardroom like a weight that pressed down on every person present, forcing them to sit with the full magnitude of what had just been revealed. It was not merely a shift in corporate structure. It was a dismantling of identity, a quiet but devastating confirmation that everything Ridge and Steffi believed they controlled had been slipping through their fingers for far longer than they had realized. The company they had fought to protect, to guide, to define, had already begun transforming into something else, something shaped not by legacy, but by strategy executed in silence. Ridge remained seated, his gaze unfocused not because he was unaware, but because he was processing too much at once. His mind moved backward, retracing decisions, moments, conversations that now appeared in a different light, searching for the point at which he could have seen this coming. There had been signs, perhaps subtle, perhaps dismissed too easily, moments when Ivy's presence had carried a quiet confidence that now made sense in retrospect. But hindsight offered no comfort, only a sharper awareness of how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. This was not a mistake. It was a calculated takeover executed with precision and patience, revealed only when resistance had already become irrelevant. Steffi, in contrast, refused to remain still. Her anger did not dissipate into silence. It sharpened, intensified, pushing her forward rather than holding her back. She moved closer to the table, her presence commanding attention in a way that cut through the lingering shock. To her, this was not over. It could not be over. She rejected the finality implied in Ivy's tone, the certainty that this new structure was already set in place. Steffi did not accept loss without a fight, and what Ivy had done, no matter how legally sound it appeared, felt like a violation that demanded a response. She began to question the legitimacy of the acquisition, not as a formal legal challenge, but as a direct confrontation, her voice rising with controlled fury as she demanded transparency. Who was the anonymous shareholder? How had the shares been transferred without detection? What agreements had been made behind closed doors? And who else had been involved in facilitating them? These were not rhetorical questions. They were attempts to force Ivy into revealing something, anything, that could be used to destabilize the position she had just claimed. Ivy did not flinch. If anything, Steffi's reaction seemed to confirm what Ivy had already anticipated, that resistance would come not through silence, but through challenge. And she had prepared for that. Her responses were calm, measured, devoid of defensiveness. She explained that every transaction had been conducted within legal boundaries, that every share acquired had been transferred with full authorization from its previous holder, and that the anonymity of the original stakeholder had been protected through mechanisms that were both legitimate and strategically necessary. There was no loophole to expose, no immediate weakness to exploit. Ivy had not broken the system. She had used it exactly as it was designed. That realization hit harder than the revelation itself, because it meant that this was not something they could undo with a single decision, not something that could be reversed through outrage or denial. It would require time, strategy, and a willingness to engage in the same level of calculated maneuvering Ivy had already demonstrated. And in that moment, Steffi understood that they were not just behind. They were outmatched in a game they had not even realized they were playing. RJ's absence from the room began to take on a new significance. Up until now, his name had hovered over the conversation as a shock, a disruption, a deeply personal betrayal layered over a corporate one. But now, as the reality of Ivy's position settled in, the implications of his involvement began to sharpen. If he had aligned himself with Ivy, then this was not simply an external takeover. It was something internal, something that had reached into the family itself and reshaped its loyalties from within. Ridge's reaction to that realization was slower, but more devastating. He had not yet spoken since Ivy announced RJ's role, not because he lacked a response, but because the response he felt was too complex, too layered to express immediately. His relationship with his son had always been defined by a mixture of pride and distance, of expectation and misunderstanding, and now that relationship stood at the center of something he could not fully comprehend. Had RJ chosen this? Had he been influenced? Manipulated? Or had he seen something in Ivy's vision that he had not seen in his father's leadership? The questions did not resolve into answers. They settled into a deeper uncertainty that made it difficult for Ridge to even look at Ivy without seeing the absence of something that had once felt unbreakable. The meeting did not end with a formal conclusion. There was no vote that could reverse what had already been declared, no immediate motion that could shift the balance of power back into familiar hands. Instead, it dissolved gradually, people leaving not because the discussion had reached resolution, but because there was nothing left to argue in that moment. The reality Ivy had introduced did not require agreement to exist. It simply was. Steffi was the last to leave. She paused at the doorway, her gaze fixed on Ivy, not with defeat, but with a clarity that suggested this was only the beginning. If Ivy believed this was the end of the battle, she was mistaken. Steffi did not need immediate victory. She needed time, information, and the right moment to strike. And as she turned away, there was a quiet promise in her expression, one that Ivy noticed and understood. Because Ivy was not naive. She did not mistake silence for surrender, nor did she believe that Ridge and Steffi would simply accept their new positions without resistance. In fact, she expected the opposite. She welcomed it, because in her mind, the hardest part was already over. The acquisition had been secured. The control had been established. Everything that came next would unfold within a structure she now defined. Still, as the room emptied and she remained alone for the first time since the revelation, a subtle shift occurred, one that no one else was there to witness. Her confidence remained, but beneath it, there was something else, something quieter, something more calculated than triumphant. She moved toward the window, mirroring the position Ridge had held earlier, her gaze following the same skyline he had searched for answers in. But where Ridge had looked for understanding, Ivy looked for confirmation. She reached into her bag and removed a small device, her expression tightening just slightly as she checked it. There were messages, not many, but enough to suggest that her actions had not gone unnoticed beyond the walls of Forrester Creations. One message, in particular, held her attention longer than the others. It was brief. No name.
No signature.
Only a single line. You've done your part. Now, be ready. Ivy's grip tightened, just for a moment. Because while she had orchestrated the takeover, while she had executed every step with precision, there had always been a question she had chosen not to fully confront. The origin of the opportunity itself. The identity of the anonymous shareholder who had made the initial transfer possible. The figure who had remained invisible even to her, whose involvement had been essential, yet deliberately obscured. For the first time since stepping into power, Ivy felt the edge of something she could not control. Not fear.
Not yet.
But awareness. Because if she had been playing a long game, then someone else had been playing a longer one. And now that she had reached the position she had fought for, the question was no longer how she had won.